You know, if there's one thing that's true about me, it's that I've always been around art and music. My mother is a painter, and my father was a musician. He played the saxophone, so I guess that's close enough, right? But I can remember one of the first philosophical thoughts I ever had, and that is, I would look at these pieces like, for example, Duchamp's fountain, and if you don't know what that is, it's just a urinal that he probably found in a junkyard and placed up on the wall in an art gallery. And I thought to myself, what makes this piece of reality art? I mean, it seems to share no real physical features with artworks any more than it does with regular everyday objects. So what can it be about these objects that makes them art? So you can imagine, for example, someone coming into the gallery, and they're going to use Duchamp's fountain for its original purpose. You can imagine people getting pretty upset about that. But what kind of mistake has this man made? What sort of mistake is it to assume something is reality when it's meant to be reality? And to answer that question is to answer the question, what makes it art? Which is a question that philosophers have been struggling to answer since 350 BCE. Now, it began with somewhat naive approaches, you might say. They said that art was reflections. It had to be sort of imitative of the real world. But quickly we have these abstract artists, people who don't really seem to be imitating much of anything at all. And so how do we make a definition that incorporates these sort of artworks? Other people have said, well, art has to convey an emotion. But of course, I'm not sure that Duchamp would agree that his fountain was meant to convey any emotions. So very quickly we realized that that's not going to work. And many methods aren't going to work because of these fountain examples, because of these found art sculptures. Because, you see, there's nothing about them physically that makes them art. There's nothing that differentiates them from reality. So it has to be something that's not physically part of the art. Now, in the 20th century, there were different sorts of approaches, such as the sociocultural approach, the historical approach. These were approaches to defining philosophy and defining art in an extrinsic way. So the first one I'd like to discuss is Dickey. Now what Dickey did was he made a historical theory of art. Now, he'd said, look, art has to be this. It has to be an object that's set against the background of the art world. Well, that's not very informative for a couple reasons. The first of which is, if Leonardo da Vinci had a painting and he stored it away so that no one would ever see it, and he decided he didn't want it to be displayed in any sort of cultural ceremony, under Dickey's definition, that would not be a work of art. Well, it seems to me that it is. I think we would all agree that it is. And of course, the second reason it fails is because with Dickey's definition, it seems that these art curators, they decide what goes into their galleries, right? And so clearly they have to decide what is and is not art. So the definition can't simply be, well, just ask the curators, they know. Well, they have to have some criteria for saying what art is. So that's not going to work. Now there was another philosopher named Levinson, and what he said was that art had to be an artifact that is regarded in the same way that past artworks are regarded. Well, also very uninformative. You see, with Levinson, he says, well, just look at the way past artworks were regarded and see if this fits in with how we regard this work. But if I gave you a definition like, well, do you know what baseball is? Baseball is an event that is held in a sort of way past baseballs were held. You would all say, well, you haven't told me much of anything. And that, I think, is the problem with Levinson's definition. Now, why is this so hard to pin down? Why do we have such a problem being able to define it? Well, I think the reason is because art is a very creative field. Every time we try to make some conditions, every time we try to define what it is, artists step outside the boundary. They push the boundaries. They break the boundaries. Artists are a bunch of rule breakers. That's what they do. And they're not condemned for it. In fact, they're celebrated for their great ability to be creative and step outside the boundaries. And that, I think, is what makes it so hard to pin down. So, if we're going to develop a definition, we're going to need to understand how concepts work that are dependent on human minds, right? Because without human minds, there wouldn't be art. So, you can take the example of like city. What is a city? Well, a city has such and such population. It's got some buildings, right? But is there anything about reality that tells us what a city is? No. We don't observe reality and say, oh, that is what a city is. No, instead what we do is we have some arbitrary criteria, right? And we say that's what a city is. Anything that meets those standards, we'll call that a city. And I think that's the very same thing that's going on with art. So now we have to understand, how is it that we're going to bestow ordinary objects with arthood, right? Well, we do so in a very interesting way, and we do it all the time. Imagine I'm standing next to a stream, and floating down the stream is this piece of driftwood. I wade into the stream, I take this piece of driftwood, and I bring it ashore. Ordinary driftwood. Then, I use it to dig up the dirt, as if a shovel. Now, what has just happened here? Well, what has happened is, I have bestowed a new function onto that ordinary piece of driftwood. It is now no longer just driftwood, it is also a digging tool. And this is something humans are capable of, just bestowing functions. So what sort of function do we need for art, to be necessary of art? Well, I think the only applicable answer is the aesthetic. Art just wouldn't be art if it wasn't for the aesthetic. Now, aesthetic is a term thrown around a lot, but what does it mean? Well, that's a difficult question. But you can be sure that it has to do with significant form. It has to do with what the object's form is. Now, how does one endow an object with significant form? How does an object become art? Well, what happens is humans take an object, they observe an object, and they bestow an aesthetic function on that object. And without that aesthetic function, it would not be art. It is thus a necessary function. Necessary aesthetic function. And therefore, the definition of art, my definition, is as follows. Art is an artifact, which is any sort of abnormality, any sort of object, sound waves, what have you. Any sort of artifact that has a necessary aesthetic function. That is what art is. And this is the creative frame of mind. I mean, look around you. There's chairs, there's pamphlets, but all of them have the potential to be art. And this is what artists do. They look around them and they say, wow, these things are aesthetic and can have an aesthetic function. In fact, just take a look behind me at these rocks here. These rocks have been sitting here the whole time. I haven't done much with them. But I put them here with the purpose of adding aesthetic to my performance. And thus I have endowed them with a sort of arthood. And that is something everyone in this room is capable of doing. So start looking around and thinking and looking at objects and really seeing the beauty, the ugliness, the intrigue. And that is how you be in an aesthetic frame of mind. Thank you very much.